Okay, guys, so we're following up from class today from extract 4, I think we needed to look at actually. Examine the reflections of the narrator on the above extract in the major paragraph on page 239. So we're looking at that moment after Aschenbach has undergone this extraordinary kind of profound meditation on the connection between his own attraction for Tadzio and the connection to the interaction between Socrates and Phaedrus. We have this shift in the narrative voice in that section, particularly in contrast to the early passages of the text, where each of the characters, the voice itself is significantly less sensuous and expansive in the opening of the text, and then in this passage of the text, it's far more emotive and expansive in terms of the sentence structure and the prose style. But then we have a narrative voice immediately after this that sort of reflects on that sensual immediacy. So we're looking at this passage here. The writer's joy is the thought that can become emotion, the emotion that can wholly become a thought. At that time, the solitary Aschenbach took possession and control of just such a pulsating thought, just such a precise emotion, namely that nature trembles with rapture when the spirit bows in homage before beauty. He suddenly desired to write. Eros, indeed, we are told, loves idleness and is born only for the idle. But at this point of Aschenbach's crisis and visitation, his excitement was driving him to produce. The occasion was almost a matter of indifference, an inquiry, an invitation to express a personal opinion on a certain important cultural problem. A burning question of fate had been circulated to the intellectual world and had been forwarded to him on his travels. The theme was familiar to him. It was close to his experience. The desire to illuminate it in his own words was suddenly irresistible, and what he craved, indeed, was to work on it in Tadzio's presence, to take the boy's physique for a model as he wrote, to let his style follow the lineaments of this body which he saw as divine, and to carry its beauty on high into the spiritual world, as the eagle once carried the Trojan shepherd boy up into the ether. Never had he felt the joy of the word more sweetly, never had he known so clearly that Eros dwells in language, as during those perilously precious hours in which, seated at his rough table under the awning, in full view of his idol, with the music of his voice in his ears, he shaped upon Tadzio's beauty his brief essay, that page and a half of exquisite prose, which with its limpid nobility and vibrant controlled passion, was soon to win the admiration of many. So what we see here is this suggestion that Tadzio has provided this great ecstatic experience of inspiration. However, the experience itself is rationalized in Aschenbach's terminology as being Apollonian, based on the embodiment of ideal beauty in physical form, and then by virtue of his connection with Tadzio, which he makes sense of through the Phaedrus-Socrates relationship, he has accessed that divine sense of beauty, which has gone on to inspire him to write. Now, there's a real distance here between the narrator and Aschenbach, which doesn't always seem to occur, particularly in those moments where Aschenbach's passionate thoughts are being rendered here. However, in this moment here, a little further down, just struggling to locate it now, the narrator actually deliberately reflects on the distance between himself and Aschenbach. But at this point of Aschenbach's crisis and visitation, his excitement was driving him to produce. The occasion was almost a matter of indifference. So here, there's something kind of alarming about this, that the occasion was not actually that important. Simply the experience of writing in the presence of Tadzio is actually here what is making sense to him and providing him with fulfillment and satisfaction. And you can see this through the various possibilities that he's being asked, the various genres of writing that he's being asked to use here. An inquiry, an invitation to express a personal opinion on a certain important cultural problem, a burning question of taste had been circulated to the intellectual world and forwarded to him on his travels. And so really it was a kind of a question of aesthetics, which absolutely fits with his current concerns, thinking about his relationship with Tadzio through this aesthetic lens. And then he sets down to write and seeks to kind of crystallize in verbal form the ideal embodiment of beauty that Tadzio represents to him. And so there's just these suggestions here of distance between Aschenbach and the narrator that just draw attention to Aschenbach's own flawed methods of thinking and rationalizing the experience that he's undergoing. Just towards the end of this, he says, how mysterious this act of intercourse and begetting between a mind and a body. When Aschenbach put away his work and left the beach, he felt worn out, even broken, and his conscience seemed to be reproaching him, as if after some kind of debauch. And debauchery, obviously, has these Dionysian connotations of engaging in things that are immoral and impulsive. And there's just this faint sense here that what he has been engaged in has not been this sort of Apollonian form of artistic inspiration. It has actually been something Dionysian that he's been convincing himself was Apollonian. And so we've got this vague suggestion here that actually, even though he thinks it's been about the fulfillment of his connection with the divine beauty that he sees embodied in Tadzio, and finding an equivalent for that in language. Actually, it's been about the fulfillment of his libido, just being near the boy and finding his presence in some way uplifting and inspiring. What we try to think about in the next question is how this section presents the reader with an ironic contrast to the Phaedrus narrative explored in the previous section. And so we're thinking there about how this ironically reflects on the paradigm that he uses for himself of Socrates with Phaedrus. On the following morning, just as he was leaving the hotel, he noticed from the steps that Tadzio, already on his way to the sea and alone, was just approaching the beach barrier. The wish to use this opportunity, the mere thought of doing so, and thereby light-heartedly making the acquaintance of one who had unknowingly so exalted and moved him, the thought of speaking to him, of enjoying his answer and his glance, all this seemed natural. It was the irresistibly obvious thing to do. The beautiful boy was walking in a leisurely fashion. He could be overtaken, and Aschenbach quickened his pace. He reached him on the boarded way behind the bathing cabins. He was just about to lay his hand on his head or his shoulder, and some phrase or other, some friendly words in French were on the tip of his tongue, when he felt his heart, perhaps partly because he had been walking fast, hammering wildly inside him, and felt so breathless that he would only have been able to speak in a strangled and trembling voice. He hesitated, struggled to control himself, then was suddenly afraid that he had already been walking too long close behind the beautiful boy. Afraid that Tadzio would notice this, that he would turn and look at him questioningly, he made one more attempt, failed, gave up, and hurried past with his head bowed. Now, in broad terms, obviously, this reverses the power dynamics that we see in the relationship that he alludes to between Socrates and Phaedrus, that the elder man is the one with the divinity, the loving, worshipful admiration of the younger, beautiful boy is the one with the divinity inside of him, and actually with the intellectual power over the younger apprentice. Well, here, the power is very clearly tilted away from Aschenbach because we're looking at it purely on the realm of beauty and sexual libido. And Aschenbach is old and physically unattractive in comparison with the young, beautiful Tadzio. And so the power dynamics are shifted very firmly away from him here. And so that lack of power is in stark ironic contrast to the philosophical allusion that he makes use of to try and justify his compelling kind of connection with the boy. The style of this is interesting as well, because what we have here in this opening is this one whacking great sentence The wish to use this opportunity, the mere thought of doing so, and thereby light-heartedly making the acquaintance of one who had unknowingly so exalted and moved him, the thought of speaking to him, of enjoying his answer and his glance, all this seemed natural. It was the irresistibly obvious thing to do. Now, that sentence there is interesting for a number of different reasons. Firstly, all of these relative clauses, this sort of proliferation of relative clauses and modifiers that change the description of the experience, the wish to use this opportunity, the thought of doing so, and thereby light-heartedly making the acquaintance of someone who had exalted and moved him, the thought of speaking to him, of enjoying his answer and his glance, all this seemed natural. So we've got all of these different components to the experience that he's envisioning here, which is telling us that he's thought absolutely deeply about the possible connections with Tadzio. And the wicked irony of this is that this is a child, and the thinking round this experience that he's obviously done, that the desire to speak and to reflect lightheartedly and to think about having the opportunity to talk to him and enjoying his glance is something that appears to be deeply ironic because of the childish innocence of the person that is the object of this romantic attachment and desire. However, the phrase that it was the irresistibly obvious thing to do shows us this kind of a sense of tension here, because there's something irresistible about it, because he is not in control of what he's doing. He's not in control of these impulses. And the only way it's obvious is to himself. This is not obvious to a bystander. And so the obviousness of this experience to Aschenbach shows us the way that he is becoming more and more immersed in his passions, because that perspective is the one in which he is immersed, that it seems obvious and perfectly normal to do. So the beautiful boy was walking in a leisurely fashion and could be overtaken, and Aschenbach quickened his pace. He reached him on the boarded way behind the bathing cabins. He was just about to lay his hand on his head or his shoulder, and some phrase or other, some friendly words in French were on the tip of his tongue, when he felt his heart, perhaps partly because he had been walking fast, hammering wildly inside him, felt so breathless that he would only have been able to speak in a strangled and trembling voice. Now, there's a number of different things here that are ironic. Some phrase or other, this casual throwaway response to language, this sort of blasé treatment of language, is the very stark opposite and contrast to his, the previous meditations on bringing from the marble mass of language the form of beauty in carefully crafted prose. So this is a complete loss of this sense of linguistic craft and control that is his hallmark as an artist. And then these descriptions of his bodily responses here, his heart, perhaps partly because he'd been walking fast, hammering wildly inside of him, felt so breathless that he could only have been able to speak in a strangled and trembling voice. He struggled to control himself. So here we see this in lots of different ways. Obviously, it's the physical response to the scene itself, but it's the emotional power of the feeling of attraction that he is experiencing that results in both his loss of physical control, but also his loss of linguistic control. He can't speak, and he has a strangled and trembling voice. And for someone who is as precociously gifted with words as Aschenbach is in the story, this is a great sign of an alteration and a moment of crisis. And the final passage of this is afraid that Tadzio would notice him in this state of fright and anxiety. He makes this one last tragic, pathetic attempt, fails, gives up, and hurries past with his head bowed. So he ends this scene in absolute, in a kind of abject state of defeat, because he's simply too nervous. He's constructed an idealized image of the boy that has made him far too nervous to contemplate speaking to him. So we move on to the next question here. How does the passage present Aschenbach's degeneration and gradual decline? With the passage on page 241. It begins on the flip side. So here he's talking about At the top of the page, he says he was confused. He was afraid that someone, even if only the bathing attendant, might have witnessed his haste and his defeat. He was very much afraid of exposure to ridicule. For the rest, he could not help inwardly smiling at his comic sacred terror. Crestfallen, he thought, spirits dash like a frightened cock hanging its wings in a fight. Truly this is the God who, at the sight of the desired beauty, so breaks our courage and dashes our pride so utterly to the ground. He loses track here, and he toyed with the theme, gave rein to his enthusiasm, plunged into emotions he was too proud to fear. And so what he's convincing himself here, and you can see this through the ellipsis, the break in his reasoning, that actually he's engaging in a type of artistic heroism by persisting with his attraction to Tadzio, and that's where his pride in his mind is getting the better of him. So he seems to be, admitting to a sense of weakness on one hand, but it's a false weakness. It's a false weakness in the sense of his fear of the beauty that Tadzio represents. But actually it's his fear of failure and of being unattractive in some way. She says he was no longer keeping any tally of the leisure time he had allowed himself. The thought of returning home did not even occur to him. He had arranged for ample funds to be made available to him here. His one anxiety was that the Polish family might leave, but he had surreptitiously learned by a casual question to the hotel barber that these guests had begun their stay only very shortly before his own arrival. The sun was browning his face and hands. The stimulating salty breeze heightened his capacity for feeling, and whereas formerly when sleep or food or contact with nature had given him any refreshment, he would always have expended it completely on his writing, he now, with high-hearted prodigality, allowed all the daily revitalization he was receiving from the sun and leisure and sea air to burn itself up in intoxicating emotion. Now, prodigality here means sort of wastefulness. He's being kind of frivolous with the sense of rejuvenation that he gets from resting. And so what we can see here is this sense of anxiety that he has about Tadzio leaving and his family. And then this description of the sun browning his face and the salty breeze provoking his capacity for feeling, as if the actual setting itself is opening him up emotionally to the expansive nature of this impulsive attraction that he has to the boy. The suggestion of degeneration is very stark at the bottom of this passage, because it's where there is a very clear explanation that he won't actually at this point use this rejuvenating experience for his writing, and that he's just wasting it all on his high-hearted prodigality, and that he was just burning this sort of sense of pleasure up in just feeling. So he's kind of delighting in the emotional feeling of actually being in love in some ways and being deeply attracted to someone. And so this is a great transformation because he's giving in. And this is a point where you can see that sense that he's delighting in being directly attracted and giving up on his control over these feelings. The final passage that we want to concern ourselves with is the very ending of chapter 4 here. And the question for the final extract is this one. How does this section portray this sort of reversal of the power dynamics from the Phaedrus extract, and how does it contribute to the text representation of Aschenbach's degeneration? So, it says he had not been prepared for the beloved encounter, and this is after he's bumped into Tadzio again. He had not had time to put on an expression of calm and dignity. So it's false and forced. Joy, no doubt, surprise, admiration were openly displayed on his face when his eyes met those of the returning absentee, and in that instant it happened that Tadzio smiled at him speakingly, familiarly, enchantingly, and quite unabashed, with his lips parting slowly as the smile was formed. There's something deeply uncomfortable about the way that he deliberates on this, because actually it's just a simple, innocent smile from a child. Aschenbach deliberates on it as, from the perspective of the muse almost, of artistic inspiration. It was the smile of Narcissus as he bows his head over the mirroring water, that profound, fascinated, protracted smile with which he reaches out his arms towards the reflection of his own beauty. a very slightly contorted smile, contorted by the hopelessness of his attempt to kiss the sweet lips of his shadow, a smile that was provocative, curious, and imperceptibly troubled, bewitched and bewitching. So again, there's this great sense of deliberation over Tadzio's beauty and the smile that he has probably given in a kind of throwaway, light-hearted, polite way as a child, and it's the source of great artistic meditation for Aschenbach, and intellectual meditation. He who had received the smile carried it quickly away with him like a fateful gift, and there's this suggestion here of this sort of ominous sealing of his fate here in that simile. He was so deeply shaken that he was forced to flee the lighted terrace in the front garden and hurry into the darkness of the park at the rear. Words struggled from his lips, strangely indignant and tender reproaches. You mustn't smile like that. One mustn't, do you hear? Mustn't smile like that at anyone. He sank down on one of the seats, deliriously breathing the nocturnal fragrance of the flowers and trees. The sense of degeneration is profound in these words where he's kind of talking to himself here. There's a suggestion of insanity in what he's doing here. And then the delirium, losing his mind, breathing in the fragrance of the flowers. So he's losing himself and his rational control in the sensory immersion in the surroundings. And leaning back, his arms hanging down, overwhelmed, trembling, shuddering all over. And again, we've got this sense of a kind of Dionysian revelry, I think, in this impulsive, almost bodily reaction to feeling this passionate. He whispered the standing formula of the heart's desire, impossible here, absurd, depraved, ludicrous, and sacred nevertheless, still worthy of honour even here. I love you. And so he's got this great list of different adjectives here that show us his internal turmoil. He knows it's absurd and depraved and ludicrous and yet sacred and worthy of honour. So still, you can see the kind of cracks in his reasoning appearing here in the way that his thinking is represented by the narrator through this passage and this final admission of being in love with the boy. And so in some ways, the power dynamics are reversed, and yet here he is in a contrasting fashion adhering to that Phaedrus illusion where, the older man is the one that is expressing that deep admiration and love for the child. And it's that expression of love that is where the nobility of admiring eternal beauty is resident.